So good evening and welcome to the 2021 Summer Archaeology Lecture Series. This is the second in a series of 4 lectures that will be delivered remotely. My name is Michael Nassaney. I'm the principal investigator of the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project. And for many years, I directed the WMU Archaeological Field School at Fort St. Joseph. This year, I am involved as a volunteer and support staff. So let me tell you a little bit about the series. We have been presenting a summer archaeology lecture series since 2011 in conjunction with the WMU Archaeological Field School. And the field school for many years, going back to 2002 and almost every year since, has been focused on investigating the site of Fort St. Joseph. So each year, for almost that many years, we have selected a different theme for the lecture series, for the open house, and for students to focus in on as they study the history and culture of the fur trade and colonialism in the St. Joseph River Valley. And this year, the theme is, as many of you know, the people of the post. So the work we do in historical archaeology is in the realm of anthropological archaeology as well. And by that, I mean, it's archaeology conducted to learn about the people who inhabited the past. We want to know about the people. We want to know what happened in the past, and we want to know who did it. So the focus on people of the post is just right in line with the anthropological archaeology that we do. So while we are involved in recovering artifacts, artifacts are the products of human activity, and as a result, they tell us about the humans who made, used, and discarded these objects. And they are our entry point into understanding the people of the post. So let me thank our sponsors. The Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project is a partnership between Western Michigan University and the city of Niles. And in the city of Niles, we're particularly thankful to the History Center and the Fort St. Joseph Museum. And a lot of the technical aspects of this lecture series is brought to us by the Niles District Library. So these are the entities that are most responsible for the lecture series and for the presentation this evening. So I want to just take a minute, and if I was doing this live, which I have done on many occasions, and it should be no different remotely, I would typically stop at this point and ask for a field school update. So field school students have been conducting work at Fort St. Joseph now. This is their second week. They've opened up a series of 1 by 1 meter excavation units, and word has it excitedly that they've begun to find 18th century artifacts. I'm going to call out Maddie. Maddie, are you there? Please unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can, Maddie. Great. Thanks for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about how things are going with the field school and some of the recent finds and maybe challenges that you're encountering?
Yeah, well, so I'll speak specifically on mine and Courtney's unit. We're over in Trench 1. It was a little slow going at first, which you know, because you were the one that came and told us, like, to kind of get, to get a little more aggressive with it. And so we have just started, we're definitely still in the plow zone. There was quite a bit of landfill at first. We had a lot of glass bottles, a lot of plastic at first, because there was, it was just on the top bit. But we are now getting into what we think is heading towards the bottom of the plow zone, because we're starting to get 18th century. We found a couple of seed beads. I think we've got 3 seed beads. We found, what else? We found some a like little needle, like a little pin that we talked to Erica, and she said it was 18th century. We were finding bone as well, which is a little interesting because we're next to the bone midden, so I'm not too sure about that. But yeah, so I think we're definitely getting down. We're near about 15 centimeters right now. We're getting close to leveling out about there. So
Okay, very good. So it sounds like you're getting beneath that 20th century trash deposit and getting into the 18th century material.
yeah, so I would say
Excellent.
the landfill was just the main challenge, is getting past that. So
Okay, very good. Okay, thanks, Maddie.
thank you.
So returning back here, let me talk a little bit about the format of this evening's presentation, some procedures. Thank you all for muting your audio, and if you haven't done so already, please do so, and this will help to eliminate distractions as this is being recorded. After I introduce our speaker for this evening, and after he has his presentation, we will of course welcome comments, and you can enter these in the chat and we could address them at the end of the presentation. You could also perhaps raise your hand at the end of the presentation in the Q&A session, and I will acknowledge you, or preferably read your question and comment in the chat, in the chat. Okay, so as I mentioned, the lecture and the Q&A will be recorded. So with that said, I don't have to tell you where the restrooms are or anything, you know where all that is and everything. So our presenter tonight is Dr. José António Brandão, and we know him as Joe Brandão. So Professor Brandão earned his PhD from York University in Toronto, Ontario, neighbor to the north in Canada, in 1995, and he joined the faculty in the Department of History at Western Michigan University in 1997. So it just happened that in 1997, 1998, that's when we did our first initial survey. So really, Professor Brandão has been in pretty much on the ground floor, if you will, on this project. So he is the author of 2 textbooks on Canadian history, 4 books of original research, and over 30 articles and book chapters, a number of which, and these are his words, he was lucky enough to have me as co-author. So isn't that nice? As a matter of fact, our most recent co-authored piece was just published, I mean like just published, in the Journal of Jesuit Studies. And it's called The Jesuits at Fort St. Joseph in Southwest Michigan. And that is open access, and you should be able to just Google that and read the article. So his research focuses upon the French presence in North America, and on the history and culture of the native groups with whom the French interacted in the years up to 1763. So he's really all about the French. He is an ethnohistorian by training and inclination, and serves as the co-director of the French Michilimackinac Research Project. And this is a huge translation project having to do with French language documents from Fort Michilimackinac. And he is also, perhaps more to the point for this evening, the consulting historian on the Fort St. Joseph Archaeological Project. So I'm fond of saying Joe has that skill, a very valuable skill in that he reads 18th century French. And this has been extremely valuable as we interpret and interrogate the documents that go alongside the material remains from Fort St. Joseph. So with that said, I'm pleased that he could join us tonight to present in the lecture series. And let me say that the title of his talk is The Men in Black, the Jesuits and Their Work at Fort St. Joseph. And now I would like to welcome Joe and thank him for participating in the series, and thank you all for your attention. Joe, you're up.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I unmuted myself, the first technical hurdle overcome. Sharing my screen. Behold the screen with a slide. So let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me again to present in the series. As Michael said, this is my presentation today is based on a paper that the two of us recently published. The focus of that was a little bit different, and I've expanded on a bit more on the Jesuits and basically cut out all the archaeology stuff that Michael contributed to the paper because I didn't want to split the speaker fee with him. But for the time being, we'll just go with that. Last week, in his presentation, Michael pointed to the ways that archaeology, with its focus on material culture, could reveal who made up the fort community and the inferences that we could make based on that about their daily lives. And today I wanted to focus on one of the groups that made up the community, even though they weren't necessarily there present all the time, as I came to know. That's the Jesuits. And I thought the title, The Men in Black, was kind of clever because, but based on the number of people who showed up, it really didn't draw more people than I'd hoped. So I'm probably just going to go back with the Jesuits and their work at Fort St. Joseph. And what we did in the paper and what I'm doing today is just sort of focusing on the documentary record to see what more we could learn about the men who worked at Fort St. Joseph and the impact that that they had. And we're still working with pretty much the same body of documents. But I thought if I've been in the past known to create tables and charts and things to see if some patterns emerge and what we might learn from them. And I thought, why not try that with the records we have at hand for the fort? And so that's what today's paper is about. Looked at that data to evaluate the outcomes of efforts, and it's pretty clear that the Jesuits produced native conversions for the communities in the fort, and that they administered to the French occupants of the fort, Euro-Americans. We don't really know whether they were French or French Canadian at this point, although depending on the period, mostly French Canadian. So I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the Jesuit order, talk briefly about the role of the order in New France, the way the men in black, or as the natives called them, the black robes, went about their work, a reference to the garb that they wore. This is a modern picture of Father Marquette preaching to Indians somewhere in the Great Lakes. To try and assess in some detail their impact on the community at Fort St. Joseph, both the Euro-American and the native ones. The men in black were, for both French and native people, intermediaries, much like in the popular movies between this world and some space world known as the heavens for Catholics. And they were quite a shock to Indians, both in the way they dressed, they looked, they were different than other Frenchmen. And the reason they were there was different. It was not about trade, it was about trying to save their souls or collect their souls, depending on your perspective. So let me begin. The Jesuits, by looking first at the Jesuits in France. The Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, was co-created in 1534 by the Basque nobleman Ignatius of Loyola, later became canonized Saint Ignatius, and it was officially recognized as an order of priests in 1540. By 1615, there were 3,000 Jesuits in France, operating, among other institutions, 89 colleges, 32 seminaries. Colleges were the equivalent of high schools. We consider them kind of private prep schools with the equivalent today. As European powers expanded to Asia and then North America, the Jesuit fields of endeavor followed. In New France, the Jesuits came mostly to inculcate and convert native peoples into the new faith. Here we go. This is the area of Fort St. Joseph. We've seen that in a bunch of different ways. And this is a map of New France superimposed over contemporary states and provinces. This more solid line reflects the closer reality of French claims. Map makers sometimes extended the map to this much larger one, but of course these are all territories controlled by indigenous peoples rather than the French, who had, as you saw in the previous slide, just a few forts here and there. By 1761, in the fall of New France, some 320 Jesuit priests and assistants had come to minister to natives primarily and to French colonists in the regions of St. Lawrence, Great Lakes, and Louisiana. Almost 2/3 of that number arrived in the 17th century. Sustained Jesuit activity and dominance in missionary work began really in 1632, when New France was returned to the French after a brief scuffle with the English. And by 1640, there were 40 Jesuits working in New France, where there was a nascent institutional church in Quebec, but not really much else. No bishop, no formal parishes had yet been established. And this is not really surprising, because as the scholar of French Catholic France, Luca Codegnola, has written, the main reason for the existence of an ecclesiastical organization in Canada was the salvation of Indians and not the spiritual well-being of the population of European origin. Part of France's claim to North America, in contrast with others, was to the Pope, we are going to convert the people that we find. And so the focus of the early Catholicism was on conversion, which is why it was primarily missionary orders who came first. Even when formal parishes were established, however, most religious activity, work, sacraments, celebrating masses, marriages, baptisms, and so on, in the churches of Quebec and later Montreal and Three Rivers were in fact carried out by missionaries, Jesuits who were stationed in those areas, and members of the Order of the Society of Saints Peace, Sulpicians. The Jesuits further contributed to the religious and social welfare of settlers by, among other things, establishing the first college in New France, 1635, and by supporting charity work through working with organizations of women religious who established hospitals and schools, and contributed important reports on the scope of New France's holdings, and the French crown supported them annually, about 25,000 livres a year. But the order was primarily, the work was primarily supported by patrons in France. The news of that and fundraising was done by the Jesuit Relations, series of annual reports indicating the challenges and successes of the Jesuits in New France. If you look over my shoulder, it's probably hard to see. There's a whole shelf of those black books with little red things on there. Those are modern reprints of collections of annual reports, but also letters and other things that were related to the mission of New France. In all, the version that I have is a reprint of something that Reuben Gold-Thwaites published in the late 1800s, early 1900s, 73 volumes of it. It's the most extensive collection of material on Jesuit activity in New France. The order was officially suppressed in France and New France in 1763, and then throughout the Catholic world in 1773. But the Jesuits continued to work even though the order wasn't recognized. The Jesuits remained in different parts of French colonial holdings for quite some time. Jesuits in New France were, by the time they arrived, had been doing missionary work first in Europe. Their original mission was to educate and to make Catholics more familiar with the teachings of the church. They found remarkable ignorance. They believed that in part the Protestant Reformation was made possible by poor training of Catholics who didn't fully understand their faith, and their first effort was to bring those collapsed Catholics back into the fold. But by the time they came to North America, they had also been working in other parts of the world, including in Asia. They adapted methods to reflect the cultures and the cultural practices of the groups they were trying to convert, the political and economic circumstances of the day, how much money they had, how many men they had available, and how much time they could devote to any particular group. Almost all of the Jesuits were university trained in the liberal arts, which in that era was understood to include rhetoric along with natural sciences and mathematics. And again, this training was central to the order because education was how they intended to convert, through education, educating people to be good Catholics. In adapting to their practices, as necessary, the Jesuits sometimes, if the group was a hunter-gatherer group, they embedded themselves with the group and followed them in their regular routes as they went hunting, fishing, and following the seasonal cycles. In mission fields at great distances from Quebec, they would often establish a central post or mission from which the priests would go to outlying villages in Southern Ontario. Here it was St. Marie among the Huron, and in what is now Michigan and the heart of the Great Lakes, it was Michilimackinac at first. And all the priests that came to Fort St. Joseph were assigned to the Ottawa mission at Michilimackinac. Fort St. Joseph was one of the places they were to minister to. Closer to the St. Lawrence, they established reserves, not reservations, because the land belonged to the Jesuits rather than to the Indians. And what they did is they encouraged the Indians to move to the reserves to keep them from what they believed were the contaminating influences of other natives who hadn't converted and those French traders who were not exactly living moral lives. But Indians on the reserves were expected to live as they had in their village. It was just a French village where you would learn to be a Catholic along with everything else that you did, farming as you did, hunting as you did, and so on. When in native communities, as was in the case in the Upper Great Lakes and in the more distant missions, the Jesuits again lived in the communities. They tried to learn the language. They were linguists. They wrote dictionaries of the various native groups and languages they encountered. And they practiced a variety of methods to gain adherence, techniques that they would use to inculcate the faith. They sought, for example, first and foremost, to undermine all of the native practitioners who claimed any kind of spiritual connection. They called them charlatans and frauds and jugglers and other things, and tried to show the natives that these men had no particular skill, that they were in the thrall of a false god. And to do that, they used techniques and methods that they had developed. For example, the knowledge of science allowed them to predict an eclipse. The eclipse served as a means to show natives the power of their God, not of the Jesuits themselves. They were quick to point out that their God had given them the knowledge to determine how these things would happen. And if Indians converted, they too could learn this kind of information. They used the power of writing, for example. An Indian would be given a piece of paper with writing on it. The priest would read out to that person what was on the paper. That Indian would go with some of his friends to another community, give that piece of paper to a Jesuit in the other community who would read out exactly the same things. The Indians, according to the Jesuits at least, thought the paper spoke to them, but mnemonic devices existed among native groups. But the point was, this was unusual. And Indians may not have understood it quite the way the French intended, but it certainly spoke to these men having some unique skills. The Jesuits, as a general rule, focused on teaching the tenets of the faith and tried not to meddle too much with cultural practices as long as they didn't interfere. It didn't really matter too much who farmed and how they farmed, as long as they were farming and praying. If they were praying in Ojibwe or Iroquoian, Algonquin or Iroquoian, it didn't matter as long as they were praying properly and reverentially. What they wore was less important than how they conducted themselves. All of these things made it easier for them to convert. The Jesuits realized, as did some other missionaries, that Indians were less hesitant to accept a new idea, a new set of ideas, and more reluctant to make cultural changes along the way. So if you didn't have to make a cultural change, it was easier to convince them that this new way of thinking was beneficial to them. Didn't work for everybody, but in addition, the Jesuits had specially commissioned work and used material culture, crosses, crucifixes, medallions, specially commissioned paintings that showed aspects of Catholic faith, the birth of Jesus, the crucifixion, the Assumption of Mary, those sort of central elements of Catholicism. Heaven and hell, of course, were central to that, and hell was a hard sell for obvious reasons, especially for natives who in conflict with the Iroquois, who used fire as a way of torturing people. Most native groups, the Jesuits were disappointed to write, were willing to listen to them, but most of them said something to the effect of, you're fine the way you are, and we're fine the way we are. That's nice for you, but we don't need to do this. Some, of course, resented the efforts to convert them and change their worldview. And in the case of the Iroquois, made a number of martyrs of Jesuits. This is a detail from a map produced in 1657 by a Jesuit, Father Bressani, who was Italian, and this depicts the death of Brebeuf and Lallemant. This is Brebeuf over here. The description, clearly Bressani didn't do this. He knew that Indians didn't have this kind of look and didn't dress necessarily like this. But here's a perfect example of the Iroquois using Christian motifs. Here's a necklace, which could be construed as a cross, and here is boiling water to baptize the priests. In fact, Bressani says that this guy here, before he dumped the water on Brebeuf, said, "You baptize with cold water, which is shocking. Here I give you warm water for your pains." This, of course, was a rare occurrence. There were only about 4 or 5 Jesuits who were killed, almost all of them at the hands of the Iroquois. For the most part, natives were receptive of them, if not necessarily their message, and tolerated them, even if they found them rather strange. Father Bressani, who, it's really hard to understand why this thing looks like this. Bressani himself was captured by the Iroquois and tortured. He had 2 fingers mangled, the index finger and the thumb. And the general rule was to damage those 2 fingers so that it would be difficult for a man to hold a bow and arrow and a hatchet and so on. It was usually a sign that you weren't going to survive the torture practice. Bressani actually had to write to the Pope for special permission to celebrate the Mass, because as part of the Mass, you hold up the host with the 2 fingers and the thumb, and he couldn't because of the mangled fingers, and the Pope denied him the request for his pains. So that was cruel. But I think later on there was a change of heart. Again, for the most part, this was not the reception. It certainly wasn't the rule and the reception of the Indians in the region of Fort St. Joseph. Turning now to that region, the French were familiar with the St. Joseph River, known then as the River of the Miami, and by the early 1680s, due to the importance of the location, the Miami Indian had moved into Southwest Michigan in the 1680s, probably accompanied by Father Alloway, Claude Alloway. By 1695, the Potawatomi. Some 200 of them were relocated to that region, and they became the dominant group in the region. And the Miami eventually migrated further down into what is now Indiana. As I've mentioned before in a number of my presentations, those of you who've heard it before, by 1686, the Jesuits have been granted a patent for land on the river. And eventually, beginning in 1690-91, fort was ordered built, and it was constructed, a trading post, and it is the trading post that Michael and his team have uncovered. The post itself contained small commander's house, a building that could garrison some men, some buildings used to store trade goods. Some people lived there. Population fluctuated over the century and got bigger over the summer as the traders came and gathered. But in 1753, and then again in 1783, when we have some solid numbers, we have about 30 people living in what the French one observer called 15 huts. So about 15 small families living in the post who made their year-round home. Soldiers, traders, fired men, engagés were all in and out of the fort over that period. We don't know where the Jesuits lived at the fort and if there was a chapel. Certainly nothing has been recovered archaeologically. And of course, we don't know what these buildings might have looked like. In the mid-1680s, possibly as early as 1679, Father Alloway carried out his missionary work in that region. And then that grant was given to them. It was confirmed again just 3 years later, which suggests that until that confirmation, nothing had been built. And then shortly thereafter, even though missionary activity continued in that region after Father Alloway died, Father Claude Avignon was appointed to replace him. The forts were closed. St. Joseph, Michilimackinac, and a couple of others were recommended to be closed because too much fur was coming to France, and the crown didn't need it anymore. So it's not clear that much was built. So the references before the fort itself was constructed to the mission probably refer more than anything to a field of endeavor rather than to a set of buildings in a particular place. After 1691, the references to mission are almost always made in conjunction with the fort itself, which, as Joe Pizer has pointed out, eventually came to be called Fort St. Joseph. At two conferences held in 1702 with Miami Indians who still were part of the Fort St. Joseph community, and who the French adventurer Cadillac was trying to relocate to Detroit. The Miami were told that the governor of New France was going to build them some grand houses and lodgings. Given that at that point the forts were officially closed by the king, it's unlikely that Vaudreuil, the governor of New France, was re-garrisoning the fort, and so that might have been a promise to help support a mission building itself, which would have been in keeping with French aspirations, and certainly in the case of Vaudreuil, hoping to undermine Cadillac and keeping the Indians there and away from Detroit. There are fleeting references to chapel and a priest's house, but they vary across time and they're fairly inconsistent. So in 1712, for example, Father Gabriel Marais reported meeting his brother Joseph at the St. Joseph Mission to the Potawatomi. He made no mention of the fort or of any other Jesuit structures in the Indian village. In 1721, Father Pierre-François Charlevoix visited the area and noted at his arrival at a post where we have a mission. He made no mention of a Jesuit residence or chapel in the fort, but he recounts an incident that suggests at least there was a chapel somewhere, perhaps in one of the Indian villages. Referencing a man named Williamek, who he didn't identify, but called a well-instructed Christian, he told this story. According to Charlevoix, Williamek was lax in his practice of his faith. He told him that, and the man was so unhappy that he left, went into the chapel and said his prayers in a loud voice such that we could understand him at the missionaries' place. This suggests the existence of a chapel and a Jesuit residence of some sort, likely in or near the Indian village. No matter how close the fort was, it would be hard to expect that a voice would carry that much distance from an enclosed space. In the 1750s, Father Jacques-François Forêt Duverger, who was a priest of the Society of Foreign Missions, visited Fort St. Joseph. He was received there by Father Jean-Baptiste de la Moronnais, who was the visiting priest at the time, and at his house. And he mentions being received at Father La Moronnais' house in the context of describing the fort, which suggests then that there was a house in the fort or a place that Father La Moronnais used. The only other reference to a Jesuit residence in the fort comes from a 1761 report by Dietrich Brem, in which he notes that the commander of the post in that period was using a private house, which the priest used to use. Finally, information from the Fort St. Joseph baptismal records points to the existence of a chapel in the decades after 1721, by which point the fort had been regarrisoned. In 1741, Marie-Françoise, who was a Pawnee Indian, was baptized by Father La Moronnais and died a few days later, and she was, according to the register, buried in the church of this mission. In 1752, 2 more native children were baptized in the church of the mission. These are the lone references to a chapel at the mission, as each refers to a native Catholic event in context of an Indian person. It seems reasonable to conclude that the chapel was at the Indian village and not in the fort. This then was the mission field and place where the Jesuits labored to bring Catholicism to the French and Indian alike. What remains to be determined in the remaining minutes very quickly is the impact of those efforts. So there's a baptismal register. It's really a register of sacraments, and it's incomplete. There are no entries from 1690 to 1721, in part because the fort was closed, and there are other gaps in the record. The register reveals who ministered to the fort, but not much else beyond the names of the men. The Jesuits, whose names appear most often in the record for those years, are Father Charles Michel Messager, Father Pierre Dujonnet, Father Jean-Baptiste Le Moronnais, those 3. Others were there, but those are the names that appear most regularly in the period. Father Messager was born around 1790 in Paris, died in Rouen 1766. He taught school in France. He came to New France in 1722. He took his final vows at Michilimackinac in 1723, but by that point, he'd already made a couple of entries at the Fort St. Joseph register. By the mid-1730s, he was back to, because of illnesses, he was back to working in France. Father Dujonnet appears the second most times in the baptismal register. He was born in Vannes in France, 1704, and he died at Quebec in 1780, quite a long life. He studied theology in Paris, and at the end of his studies, moved to New France. He arrived in 1734, and the following year traveled to Michilimackinac, where he served for nearly 30 years. His first entry in the baptismal record at Fort St. Joseph was 1738, and the last in 1745. In the intervening years, his name appears more or less alternating with that of Father La Moronnais, whose record at the fort was the longest and most sustained. He was born in Périgueux, France, and died sometime in 1764, likely in France. He became a novice in the Jesuit order in 1725 and came to New France in 1736. His first entry at the register was 1740, and then his last was in June in 1760. In the end, all of this information does not do much beyond confirm their training, their job postings, commitment to serving God, through missionary work, willingness to risk danger, as the other that's relief from the map shows. But missing from their biographies are their views about their work and the people to whom they ministered. We simply do not know. That compendium of Jesuit records has no views of them of theirs about their work and what they were doing, what they felt about it. To get some sense of their impact, if they weren't going to give us that kind of information, I decided to create a chart. So I created a chart. This is the chart, a complicated chart, but I'm not a complicated person and I don't do very much with charts. The table indicates the year and the month for which there was an entry, and then the missionary for whom the entry is associated with. And you see other names that I haven't mentioned, but these were early on, and there's very little, just a few, and then you can see the names that I've mentioned over time. The month or months for each missionary based upon the dates, each entered some event. In some cases, a 1 month may include multiple entries. And sometimes this, for example, this one from May to October may include just two, one in each month. And we don't really know what happened. The register, we don't know where the register was kept, whether it was at Fort St. Joseph or at Michilimackinac, or whether it traveled back and forth with the respective missionary. It's really difficult to make much of that. Still, we can draw a couple of inferences from this. It's clear the missionaries were not continuously present at the fort. Not only were they not there every year, but when present, they didn't stay very long. It was only one of the places that they visited. Secondly, the practice of Catholicism mattered to the fort's inhabitants, not from this chart, but from the larger register, we can determine that. Children born when the priests were absent were presented for baptism when the priest showed up. Children in ill health were given summary baptism. Ill health at birth were given summary baptisms until the priest could make it official when he arrived. In 1768, 1773, and so on, children who were born to people at Fort St. Joseph were baptized outside of St. Joseph by Father Gibault, and because there was no missionary effectively at the fort in that period. We know from the case of Pierre Mekabinga, a Miami man, Mekabinga, sorry, a Miami man. He was married twice. His first wife died. All three of them were baptized in Catholic. It was only recognized Catholic in full communion with the church could such marriages be sanctioned. The record also indicates whether by opportunity or inclination, some priests were more involved with the native community than others. Father Messager, for example, noted more Indian baptisms than Father Lamorine, even though the latter was there far more. We see baptisms of French natives and so on. We see, as Michael mentioned last week, the material culture elements of this that reinforce this. Items, the cross and the crucifix. Crucifix includes the corpus of Jesus. The cross is just plain. And you see items like this. The article lists the quantities of all of these things. These are typical of the things that Catholics would use. We assume that the priests were giving some of these out. We also assume that should we find the Indian village, given the evidence of hints of a chapel and evidence of baptisms and marriages and so on, that these types of items might also be found in that context. Probably the most salient one that we've talked about before in terms of practicing the faith is this cilice item of penitential practice. You wrap that around your leg or your arm, and it has little sharp points, and it is suffering for Jesus, a way to remind you of the mortality of the flesh, and to inspire you to be a better human being. What to make of all of this? How do we assess some of these stuff? Documentary and archaeological evidence, when used together, suggests the Jesuits enjoyed some degree of success in attending to the spiritual needs of the French and their native allies, even if the results weren't always the sort of idealistic ones that they had hoped for. the Jesuits recognized this. Father Charlevoix pointed out that the Indians had been without a pastor for a long time and that someone was going to have a lot of work to bring them up to snuff. He could have made the same point about the French, who had also been without a pastor for a very long time. He thought for the Indians were, for the most part, converted, although the basis for that decision, for that conclusion, goes unrecorded. The other question, of course, is the sincerity of conversions and how do we measure those? And it's kind of a mug's game in terms of an argument, because how sincere are Catholics themselves, whether they're born Catholic or, like, if you go to church on Easter and Christmas and don't do anything else, are you a good Catholic or just a Catholic? Is that enough? I mean, I always think most of that stuff would be between people and their God, much as priests sometimes intervene. And so the question of assuming sincerity of belief among Catholics and presuming that we need some kind of litmus test for Indians is unfair. And it also disparages the power of religion to help explain the world. And the early missionaries, and certainly the Jesuits were among them, were very careful with some of these items. They didn't want the Indians to think of these things as talismans or amulets that could protect them from evil. But the French historians point out that even among the French, even in Quebec proper, Catholics believed some of these amulets and crosses, and some crosses, rosaries and things like that did serve as amulets. They did ward off evil. So the ignorance of faith assumed for one and missing in another is somewhat problematic. I think that the best we can do is look at the data, the evidence, and what we have before St. Joseph suggests that the Jesuits, while not perfect, were able to achieve some of their goals, minister to the French, bring natives into the fold, sustain them in their faith. And so for the natives, the men in black represented an opportunity to add something new. And to add something new doesn't necessarily mean throw everything from the old. This is another little inset from that Bressani map. And here we have a couple of Huron women praying. But as you can see, this is native garb. They are praying to a Christian God, and still they're Indians. To add a religion doesn't mean to lose everything that you've had about your life. You can incorporate without losing. So the men in black wound up presenting for Indians a means for those who wanted to listen to try to understand the world that had changed around them. And for the French at the fort, the men in black represented a familiar sight and comfort in their world. The end.
Thank you, Professor Brandão. You probably can't hear it on your end, but there's now raucous applause that I'm hearing. So
thank you very much.
Yeah. Let's see. I think people are just taking a moment to collect their thoughts because you've given them so much to think about. And they'll be entering their questions in the chat if they haven't done so already. So audience, please do that. And I can also acknowledge some of you if you would prefer that. And while we're getting to that, though, I wanted to pose a question to you.
I figured you would.
That's why they pay me the big bucks. So you were talking about, at the end there, you were talking a little bit about, well, throughout, you were talking about the central core beliefs of Catholicism. You didn't say quite as much about native religions. Of course, those maybe are less fully understood, but we know that at least some native groups believed in animism, the idea that there were powerful forces at work in the universe, in the wind, and in a kettle that worked particularly well, and so forth. So anyway, my question is this: given what we know about Jesuit and Catholic beliefs and what we know about native beliefs, is there any overlap between those two categories where the French, for example, maybe could have taken advantage and built upon those similarities, or would you prefer to emphasize the vast differences between these belief systems? I'll leave it at that.
The Jesuits saw these things, and they tried to use them to their advantage. And in doing so, they obviously devalued native worldviews. But for example, Indians would burn tobacco in an offering to a spirit or a rock or a tree to ask the spirit of that thing to help them out. The Jesuits saw this as both frightening, they're worshiping a devil, but also hopeful. Well, they understand the concept of incense as a way to create a space for communicating with another spirit. So that concept is okay. Its application is completely wrong. But how can we take advantage of that? So they did look for things that might connect with elements of Catholicism, and of course tried to change it in native understanding about that particular thing. How effective they were, how much they were able to these are complex ideas, and how much they were able to convey about the distinctions, it's hard to say. Among some groups, the Iroquoians, for example, they had their creation story involved a woman falling from the sky. So the Jesuits try to relate that to the Virgin Mary and the birth of Jesus. So where they could find elements that they could bring to draw parallels to, they certainly were not adverse to that. But anything that looked sacrilegious or devil worshiping, and they saw the devil everywhere, that they worked really hard to try and snuff out, again, with a credible range of success and failure.
Great. Okay, we're getting some questions in on the chat here. So one of our listeners asks, were the activities of fur collection and trading by the natives, I'm thinking is what's meant here, merely tolerated by the priests or encouraged by them, or completely separate?
No, the Jesuits were not adverse to Indians earning their livelihood. Work was good for you. And if a person hunted and traded what they hunted, either food or the pelts or something, that was fine. And certainly they weren't unaware of the fact that the fur trade was important to the economic well-being of the colonies. So they were not adverse to that. They didn't get away with it. They did not get in the way of that. And they often argued for better prices for people and wrote scathing reports of traders who they felt had treated Indians unfairly.
Let me add on to that. Were the Jesuits involved in fur trading directly, either at Fort St. Joseph or at Michilimackinac, to your knowledge?
Yeah, that always comes up, and the short answer is no. They weren't fur traders. They didn't commission stuff. They received pelts as gifts, and just like everybody else, they bought and sold goods, and they used what they bought and sold to support the mission. So they had a seigneury. There were trade licenses. They held a trade license. They sold the license or leased the license to fur traders who would use the license, and the revenue from the license is what they used. They weren't allowed to engage in trade because of their vows of poverty, but that didn't mean that they couldn't raise money to do what they did. I forget, there was one scholar, whose name escapes me now. He says most of the stuff can be traced to either Protestant missionaries who really were angry at the Jesuit, what they saw as the threat of Jesuit success, and fur traders who thought that the Indians were more loyal to the Jesuits than to them and didn't want them to compete. Certainly you see some of the French colonial officials who were dabbling in the fur trade also writing these kinds of letters. The Jesuits were a powerful group and had many, many enemies.
Okay, several more questions here. So let's see. One is, what, in your opinion, was the worst type of mortification conducted?
Self-flagellation. The Jesuits believed that certainly among the early adherents, they took to self-mortification and sometimes whipped themselves to the point where they were causing serious damage and risking their health. But things like the silice would not be readily visible to a missionary, but the self-flagellation part was, and this was more noticeable in the reserves rather than in the communities, although it did happen in the indigenous communities themselves.
Okay. So another one of the students asked, so we know of some of the methods used to convert the indigenous population. Are there any ideas of the methods used to keep them in the religion? Or was it once you're in, you can't get out type of conversion?
One of my students early on in my career asked me, what do you call someone who leaves the Catholic Church? And according to the Catholic Church, Protestant. But the other answer is you can't. Once a Catholic, always a Catholic. To keep the people converted required something that wasn't happening at Fort St. Joseph, a real regular priestly presence, regular celebration of Mass, following through with catechism, and the progression of the various sacraments that are part of it, the same thing that any practicing Catholic would have to go through. And that was basically it. But there were, as you can see from the chart, large gaps when there really wasn't anybody there. And so the practice was incomplete, but that was true for the French inhabitants of the outposts as well.
Okay, very good. So here's another question. These are coming from groups of students, so I guess they must be in pods or something. Let's see, is the silice still the only one found in North America? Well, we do have an answer to that. And the second part of that question is, do you believe the presence of it at the fort is a significant find regarding Catholicism in the New World?
At the time that it was found, it was the only one. As you pointed out the other day, it no longer is. I do think it's significant. It's the first example of a metal silice. A silice, for the most part, and it continued even after the metal ones were in use, was a hair shirt. It was something made of either goat hair or horse hair, that the equivalent of a girdle or a vest that you wore underneath, so that no matter which way you turned, it was chafing and poking into your skin. Finding something made of leather was going to be difficult, but finding a metal one, that's real. That's a clear sign that somebody had bought into the whole notion of penance and suffering and trying to emulate Christ. And that's pretty compelling. I remember telling my local priest about this, and he was excited as can be. And he's the one who volunteered that the founder of his order used one his entire life. So I was more taken aback that those things were still used in the 1900s, but yeah, I think it was significant. Yeah.
Certainly a point of pride for Bishop Scalabrini, apparently. So
it's in the Scalabrini Museum.
Yeah, there you have it. So there's another one here about the silice, always a provocative object. The student says that they comment that there are 2 silices found in North America. What do you know about the other silice? Did its discovery had any implications for the one found at Fort St. Joseph? Do you think they're related in any way? Let me say a couple things and then you can jump in, Joe. As I recall, the other specimen was found among the Jesuits in Maryland. And I think it might be commented on in that in that special collection in the Journal of Jesuit Studies
Yeah.
that we contributed to. So maybe more information is in there. I don't know. Can you add anything to that?
No, that was the first I've heard of it. And I don't know that it would be later. The Jesuits, I think it was from a later period. I don't think he was in this early period. The Jesuits were there for a while in Maryland from the early period on, but their plantation was something that came later on in the history of the period, I think, but I'm not sure what the period association is for that other facilities.
Now, Maryland was a Catholic state, as I recall.
Yeah, it
Was
was well, I mean, it was granted. It was a land grant to the Charles family, Carroll family, I think. Yeah, it was Catholic. It remained Catholic until the Revolution.
And Jesuits there were there into the 19th century.
Yeah, they founded I think it was one of the universities there. And they've been in the paper lately because the Jesuits sold all of their slaves. They had a bunch of slaves. They sold them all and served in bondage into the South as a way to pay the debt to maintain the college. I just can't remember the name of the college. Very recently, they undertook a significant fundraising effort to create an endowment to pay reparations to the descendants of the enslaved peoples that they sold.
Could that be St. Mary's College?
No, it's one of the better universities like Washington University or something like that.
Okay, another question, moving on.
Georgetown, someone mentioned Georgetown. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So let's see, this person noted that there were more crosses than crucifixes found at Fort St. Joseph. And the question is, what does finding more crosses versus crucifixes at the fort say about religion at the fort?
That's a good question. It could be a question. It could be a matter of technology. A cross is simpler and cheaper to make than one with a crucifix. It might be easier to hand out those. It could also speak to wealth. Maybe more expensive to find one or to buy one with the corpus on it. I don't know. I'd just be speculating, but.
So I think another part of the argument that maybe didn't make fully in the article, but as I seem to recall, the crosses were predominantly silver, which tended to be more common like post 1760. And so it may be that these were more secular objects in that period as well, since they didn't have the corpus on them and so forth. So they may have been more like trade goods, if you will. Okay, so this might be a question for both of us. The findings of, let's see, well, yeah, okay, let me continue with that. Are the findings of crosses versus crucifixes consistent across multiple sites of French colonial occupation? If no, could this be because Fort St. Joseph had less access to resources, or because they were less devout due to full-time missionaries not being on site full-time? There may not be an outright answer, but I'm curious about your opinions on the topic. So again, this issue of crosses versus crucifixes.
Well, you did a comparison to the stuff at Michilimackinac.
Yeah, we did. I think yeah, and I don't remember the exact numbers and so forth. I think there were some differences that might have been important though. So, okay, so I've got another question here. How was the belief in Catholicism reinforced to the indigenous peoples if the missionaries weren't always there? Was it completely up to the fort's other inhabitants? What kept them in line?
From other accounts, we know that in some communities, some people took on the role and became prayer captains, led prayers, led saying the rosary. But there's no indication that anybody was appointed to that role. And there's no indication that anybody in the fort, the Euro-Americans, took on that role. It really, people were left to their own devices.
Mhm. Okay. So I know students had the opportunity to learn about faunal analysis today. The site zooarchaeologist Terry Martin was in town. And so this student is asking, they're wondering if religious practices might show up in faunal remains in the animal bones found at the site. Specifically, how did religion perhaps influence or affect the diet? You can tell us about beaver and fish.
Well, I forget the total number. There were in this period a remarkable number of fast days, not complete fasting, but when you weren't, you needed to abstain from meat, which for the vast majority of people wasn't readily available anyway, although it was in North America, but not in Europe. And at some point, I think it was the Academy of Sciences in France, that this was put to them, and then it went to somebody decided that the tail of the beaver is in fact fish, but the body is meat, and so you could eat beaver tail on Fridays and Good Fridays and stuff like that, but not the rest of the animal. The practices, diet, it should show up that there's a lot more fish. There should be a lot more fish available, but it's also a function of where you live and what's found. I mean, you should find a lot of fish bones, and you certainly do in Missionaries. And I think Lynn Evans says that fish remains, fish bones, or probably scales even, are probably the most common faunal remain up there.
Yeah,
but I don't know that we found anything like that. It's not the case in Fort St. Joseph.
Precisely. Conversely, fish are quite rare. Let's see, Suzanne Somerville, hello Suzanne, notes that her comment is no silice was found at Fort Pontchartrain, the Detroit area, but the discovery of the burial of Father Del Hal was confirmed because of finding a silice in his grave. Interesting. Thank you, Suzanne.
So that goes to your point last week about digging up people. It was not uncommon in this period for people to be disinterred and then reburied in some other place. It happened fairly commonly, and especially if the person was believed to have lived a particularly holy life, and there's a chance that they might be declared a saint. So this was quite common. Father Marquette was dug up and then reburied up in Michilimackinac, and Father Lemorigny, who was at Fort St. Joseph, apparently pilfered some of Father Marquette during the process, because that other priest, Duverger, who the Society of Foreign Missions, who traveled through Fort St. Joseph, was given a piece of, I believe it was Father Marquette's thumb as a holy relic.
It's his thumb or his jaw?
I can't remember. It was a piece of Marquette that Marquette probably would have wanted to keep altogether. I can't remember.
Yeah. Okay. Let me follow up with a question on mortuary practices. So the baptismal register that you use to compile the periods when the priest was in residence, of course, records baptisms and marriages, which are 2 of the 7 sacraments. And typically a sacrament would take place upon death as well. So what I'm getting at here is if there are any records of that sacrament, and what of French mortuary practices? Do we know much about that? Because the question last week was, where might they be burying all these people who died at Fort St. Joseph?
The number of people who are buried or recorded as dying at the fort is relatively small, and I can't find it now. I think it was less than 5. So we know, for example, that some of the people in the fort show up in the marriage, showing up being married in other forts. For example, Michilimackinac. I can't imagine that someone goes someplace else to die. You know, they might know that they're dying, but I can't explain it.
Okay.
I just can't explain why those numbers are so low. The population was relatively low, but more people, the population numbers are fairly stable, but more people had to die than just the few that show up. What the practices are to have a cemetery.
Okay.
There should be a cemetery that marks out consecrated ground for those who die with the last rites and so on, and some other burial place for those who don't have that. But
Sure, and possibly near Father Alloway's grave, but who knows for sure. Okay, well, the good news is, the bad news is we're maybe running out of time. The good news is we have lots of questions. So I'm going to propose this, kind of like a speed dating thing, okay? So I'm going to give you a question. Some of these you can answer very, very briefly, I think. Okay.
You know me, right? That's very difficult, right?
If well, you're gonna hold you to like 10-second responses now. If an ill child was given a provisional baptism, who would have given the provisional baptism?
Usually someone in a position of authority. I think the name that shows up most often is the post commander, whoever was in charge at the time.
Okay. What was Father Alloway's special position at Fort St. Joseph?
He didn't have a special position. He was missionary before the fort was built.
Okay. Do you think the chapel could have been an itinerant structure?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Anyone can baptize, even. All right. I'm going to skip that sort of longer comment.
It's true though. Anyone could, but the name that shows up most often is the post commander.
Let's see. And even so, okay, even non-Catholics, and if performed properly with the right intent, it was a valid baptism, but should be followed by the supplied rituals performed by a priest and the naming of godparents and entry into the registry for future reference. The primary source document for the fort, where are they housed at?
The baptismal register is now published. I've never been able to locate the original, but most of the primary sources for the history of New France are in the Canadian archives, regional archives in Quebec, and a bunch of them on microfilm at Western Michigan University Zhang Legacy Collection. They're part of the French Michilimackinac Research Project. All the correspondence to and from France, the Montreal Merchant Records, et cetera, et cetera. And the Jesuit relations are available online, digital format.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Brandão. Sorry to rush you through those last few questions and comments.
Pleasure.
We really appreciate your insight into the Men in Black. Let me remind, I'll give you the last word in a second here. Let me just remind our listeners that the series continues. Next week, Bob Myers will be talking about one of the British officers at the site and his sad circumstance, and Bob from the Historical Society of Michigan, and then Lorraine DeSerbo of the French Canadian Heritage Society of Michigan will close out the series on July 28th. Professor Brandão, any final words?
Thank all of you for listening. Thank you for the questions and the comments. I wish all my classes could be this lively.
Great. Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Joe. Bye. Good night, all. Recording is over. Not yet.